Hello, this is Dr. Betty Rubinowitz, NextGen Healthcare's Chief Medical Officer and Principal with NextGen Advisors. I'd like to welcome you to our podcast, and as usual, I'm joined today by my colleagues Graham Brown and Dr. Marty Lustig. Welcome, Graham and Marty.
Hello, Betty. Great to be with you.
Thanks, Betty. It's great to be here.
So much has been written and said about the SARS-COV-2 Delta variant. It's estimated that the virus has gone through more than about 12,000 mutations since it emerged in late December of 2019. But the Delta variant has been and has become the dominant variant in many countries. Notably, it's responsible for the serious, deadly wave of infections in India. The Delta variant is also becoming the dominant variant here in the US. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about how variants are created and whether there is an evolutionary purpose that they serve for the virus itself. Marty, what do you know about that?
Well, it's certainly not my area of expertise, but just sort of in general, viruses by their very nature, like any other RNA or DNA-based organism, is going to have mutations along the way, the overwhelming majority of which will either be insignificant or result in destruction of the virus. But unfortunately, when you're talking about the orders of magnitude of the number of viruses being produced, if you multiply the number inside each cell, inside each person, across all the people who are infected, you're talking about billions of reproductions occurring, and so even a very small percentage of those occasionally result in a characteristic that makes the virus either more infectious, which is to the virus's advantage. It can spread easier from one host to another, which its general evolutionary goal is to keep reproducing itself. It can also make them more deadly.
Mm-hmm. Graham?
Well, just on Marty's point, it's important, I think, for us to recognize that the virus, as we've seen the mutations occurring now, really has been focused on infecting more people. So globally, about 180 million people have been infected with some version of SARS-CoV-2 so far, out of 6 to 7 billion population. So there's huge opportunity for the virus to continue to find new hosts and to continue to evolve. And Marty alluded to an important difference between whether the virus evolves to become more infectious, and i.e. easier for people to get sick from and infect more people with the variant that it has, or whether it becomes more virulent, which is really a measure of how much impact the virus has on the host. How sick does that person get? Does the virus kill them? Does it make them severely ill and hospitalized? Does it give them a sore throat and loss of sense of smell? And they just kind of suffer it like they would a cold at home. So there's some real differences in terms of how the virus is evolving here. And thankfully, so far, we haven't seen research that's showing that the virus is getting more virulent. It's not more deadly, but it's certainly growing and continuing to affect more people.
It's interesting to me because this almost feels like a fast-forward movie of evolution as a whole, because the life cycle of the virus is so short and rapid that we begin to see the forces that are at play that in the natural world as a whole take millions and millions of years to select out those organisms that will survive or thrive or go extinct. This is happening in very rapid fire. And the other thing that has been fascinating to me is how in our speech about this, how we begin to attribute a will or a desire or a life to the virus. The virus wants to, the virus prefers to, the virus, which has just been an interesting observation, how we have almost given the virus cognizant, conscious decision-making powers. We're really what we're referring to is a very basic biological selective process that is very common and very tested and tried.
Mm-hmm. It's probably partly due to watching too many science fiction movies. But I think another interesting twist in this issue is what a perfect storm this particular virus has been, in that if you think about it, in terms of if the goal of the virus is to reproduce as much as possible, the death of the host is not a positive outcome for the virus. It really, the longer it can sit in a host and be spread to other hosts, the better that is for the virus. And so the fact that this virus causes such severe illness in a subset of the population and almost no illness in another set is kind of, from a human suffering perspective, is a perfect storm of a viral illness that doesn't kill enough people to go extinct, but kills enough to cause a lot of devastation.
Absolutely, and continue to that is the fact that it's contagious before people have symptoms.
Yeah.
So it is doing its work unbeknownst stealth, and in that regard is ideally designed to infect as many people as possible. We're going to avoid in this conversation the questions of the origin of the virus, but those who feel that it was engineered feel that this ideal composition of its characteristics supports a theory of an unnatural world origin. And again, we're not qualified or going to touch on that today.
I think one of the interesting things, though, Betty, about having watched the evolution of the discussion and the knowledge around COVID and its variants over the past year is the recognition in whenever it was, sometime last summer, that indeed people could be asymptomatic carriers. That we started realizing when we had enough case history and enough individuals and could actually detect the viral load within somebody's body, but they never got ill, that the virus was more sophisticated, or it had these attributes that you're describing, that we're just slowly starting to realize not only are present, but actually have implications for how survivable this virus will be in the human species and in other subspecies and related species, right? Humans aren't the only ones that get this virus, and indeed they're now tracking it in other animals, where it will also continue to evolve. And create new capabilities and new powers, which may come back to humans later in time. So our knowledge around this really is pretty nascent. And while it's gone through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of life cycles, as you're saying, because it's so rapidly evolving, that speck of time that we viewed so far really is pretty small in the grander universe of its ongoing evolution.
Absolutely. So we've touched on virulence and infectiousness. We've touched on Delta's, this variant's specific characteristics in this regard, and some of the evolutionary advantages that Delta variant has in this regard. Recently, there's been some worrisome data that just came out in the last 48 hours out of Israel that show that the effectiveness of the Pfizer vaccine against the Delta variant has dropped from an overall rate of 94.3% to about 64%. Its ability to prevent serious illness and prevent hospitalization has remained quite impressive, but still is down from 98.2% to 93%. Again, these numbers are not very detailed from Israel, so it's very difficult for us to understand the exact quantitative calculations that went into them. But on the surface of it, on the face of it, what are your thoughts about these numbers, Marty?
Yes, my first reaction to those numbers is that if those had been the original numbers from the original phase 3 clinical trials, we would have said this is a good vaccine. 64% effectiveness in preventing disease, 94% effectiveness in preventing serious disease is a hugely valuable vaccine, very effective, and we would have been happy with it. Now, the fact that it represents a significant decrease from the original numbers is where you kind of flip around and say, how concerning how concerned should I be about this? On that level, I think going down to 64% starts to raise questions about the need to strongly consider public health measures, even for those of us who are vaccinated. The issue about large crowds gathering indoors, all of those things I think need to be reconsidered in light of this.
Graham?
Yeah, I look at it not dissimilarly to Marty, and at the same time kind of recognize that while there's a little bit of comfort in these statistics, wherein while yes, more individuals are probable to now get infected with the Delta variant than they would have been had they been exposed to a different variant. That's the difference between the 94.3 and the 64%. More people are going to get sick. However, the change in the seriousness of that illness and the hospitalization isn't thankfully as dramatic. It's still, a few real percentage points, and when you multiply that by millions of exposed individuals, there are thousands and thousands of people that are going to get sick and get hospitalized here. There is a little bit of comfort, though, that the drop in that level of protection against serious illness isn't more dramatic than it could be. So at least it's still a pretty effective vaccine, and people should continue to get vaccinated if they're not already. It does raise the issue, of course, as to whether we need to continue to look at the composition of the inoculations and how they're actually designed to address variants. And as though, our vaccines probably need to continue to evolve here. And it certainly sets up the stage for that to come in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. So if you were the head of the federal COVID task force, what would you be doing in view of these data points? What would you be recommending to the American public, the states, the federal response? Graham?
I would, very much focus in on the hot pockets of where there is a higher level of disease burden right now and where infections are happening. Pay very much attention to the states where we have a lower level of vaccination uptake than we do in some states where it's been quite high and quite effective. And continue to double down on those efforts. We need to get people vaccinated. And then continue to work with the private sector biopharmacology industry to develop versions of vaccines that continue to evolve along with our knowledge. There are potentially, as Marty was saying, some needs to do some targeted social interventions, mask wearing, reduced gatherings, and other elements that have been very effective over the past year in preventing disease. I think we've recognized from a socio-political perspective that can't be a broad brush. We need to be very targeted in that regard, or there just won't be a level of compliance that is effective.
Mm-hmm. Marty?
I agree with everything that Graham said. I would add a little bit on that last element, in that I do think that given these numbers and where things are at in the world, that come fall and winter, we could very well find ourselves with not the Delta variant, but the Gamma variant or whatever that is even going to change these numbers further in the wrong direction. And so while I do think that the pharmaceutical companies are working hard to get the next vaccine to really stay up with this, I think that if I was in this role with the COVID task force, I would want to keep the public aware of the risk and the potential that we would have come next fall or winter, the need to go back to some virtual schooling, the need to wear masks and socially distance indoors, a whole variety, the same kinds of interventions we had before, but don't let the public fall asleep on these issues, because it could happen fairly rapidly that we need to take those measures again.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One of the things that the Israeli health authorities have been talking about is the need to provide a booster vaccine to the particularly vulnerable population, the elderly and immune-compromised patients in the population. And that indicates to me that they're seeing some of the increase in infections among vaccinated individuals among patients who likely mounted a less effective immune response to the vaccines in the first place. And those usually are older individuals and individuals with faulty immune responses to start with. This will provide a logistic nightmare to any country attempting this. What do you think the ramifications are for kind of global distribution of the vaccine? How would one even begin to tackle a task such as that?
Well, it seems to me the first problem we have to solve for is where we're already failing to get people initially vaccinated. I mean, Africa is just, there are several countries in Africa that last I heard they hadn't even begun. They literally hadn't begun vaccination of the population. And if we've learned anything from the Delta variant, we should learn that we're all dependent on what happens everywhere on the planet. And it doesn't matter where the variant starts, it's going to eventually impact us all. Look at how quickly the Delta variant went from India to the rest of the world. And so it's really in everybody's interest just to try to get the first vaccines into everyone everywhere. And this concern about adding a third or another booster to the at-risk population is a real concern, but it's a concern that the wealthier countries have the luxury of thinking about right now.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I would add to that is that, Israel has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world and has the central infrastructure at a medical record level and the ability to really track and monitor whether this is an effective intervention or not. And so while to absolutely agree with Marty's point, there's a much bigger global equity issue in terms of vaccine availability and global distribution. Within certain pockets, we recognize that Israel is in a position to purchase more vaccine, to take care of its population. It probably will undertake that as a social policy and effort, but at least it can show up with the data to show whether it works, and we can learn from this. And so, I think that in parallel with the ongoing global vaccination efforts, we need to continue to evolve our knowledge and recognize that there are in places and locations where that kind of knowledge will come to bear, and Israel's well supported and well positioned to support that research.
Absolutely. Terrific. This was, as usual, an interesting conversation. Thank you to our listeners for joining us today, and I'd like to, as always, thank my colleagues Graham Brown and Dr. Marty Lustig for sharing their insights and perspectives with us. If you enjoyed today's topic, consider subscribing to our podcast. This is Dr. Betty Rabinowitz with NextGen Healthcare. Have a great day.